So, hi everyone, and welcome back to our second lecture on Plato's Republic, in which we will focus on Plato and his conception of the good. Within this lecture, even though you had to read book 5 up to and including 8, we will mostly focus on book 7 and 6 of the Republic, as I think that these are the two most difficult books of the readings assigned for this week. But first, let us do a quick recap of what we have done so far. The previous week, we have seen that by making an analogy between the city and the state, Plato comes to a notion of justice which holds for both of them. Justice being the three parts of the soul cooperating in harmony under the leadership or rule of reason. In the city, this corresponded to the three sections or classes in the city, working to get the rulers, auxiliaries, and workers working together and in harmony under the cooperation of these also wise rulers. We've also found that justice is not just valuable for itself, but also valuable in itself, and on top of that, we've read Rawls's account of why acting justly or living in accordance with justice is both collectively and individually rational. But is this way of life also good? That is the question we will be taking up today. Now, note that in the pre-discussion, we've asked ourselves whether we only care to live in a just society when it comes to political rule, or whether we are also interested in the good or prudent leadership. We asserted that we want our governments to deliver economic growth, good schools, hospitals, low crime rates, clean air, international peace and security, effective and generous welfare programs, and, if possible, dancing in the street. If we really want the goods, must we then replace our democracy in favor of the rule of the excellent, in favor of the rule of the philosopher king? Now, when we look at Plato's description of the philosopher in Book 6, this philosopher does not seem like a person that is occupied with the political questions that we just outlined, even less occupied with dancing in the street, right? The characteristic of the philosopher given to us is someone who is occupied on the permanent, not the changing, as truth explained by Socrates must be permanent. Secondly, someone who is occupied with the mind solely and not with questions of the body, even to the extent that he diminishes the body to a non-concern. Thirdly, from this non-concern, there is the disregard for death, since it's just not a question that is on the mind of this individual who occupies himself with the contemplation of the permanent rather than the passing. So, the philosopher is so high-minded that mere human life just isn't that important to him. But as we said already, isn't politics about all these things that the philosopher seems not to care about? Isn't politics about change and leading or governing change? Isn't politics about the affairs of the body? Money, welfare, food, clothes, table, shelter, a bed to rest your head in? Don't we even say that securing safety is the primary function of a state? So, what does this philosopher have to do with ruling our state? Put otherwise, we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that Adeimantus states that this person, this philosopher, seems rather useless in the affairs of politics. In response to this, we could say that the philosopher cannot have a money-loving, cowardly, boasting, or slavish nature, and therefore is unlikely to be unreliable and unjust. But the question still remains, is he practical enough? Is he practical enough to deal with what politics is about? Here, pay attention to Socrates' answer to Adeimantus' charge. Here Socrates talks about a ship, the ship of state if you like, for the metaphor. So which role in the story is played by the democratic masses, the politicians, and the philosopher if we would hold this ship to be analogous to our modern day democracies. Within this analogy, is uselessness just an appearance? And can this appearance of uselessness be resolved? This is something that you might want to think about when reading up on this passage. So, the story continues with talking about this resolvability. Right, the conversation steers towards the kind of education that a philosopher should receive, and how this training is beneficial to the city. Note here also that when discussing the practicalities, we get an account of a soul that is governed by reason does not automatically become good or just. It must live in accordance with itself, meaning that it needs to have the proper cultivation. Otherwise, these souls could become corrupted and capable of the greatest evil imaginable. The biggest problem for Plato here, concretely, is that this rationally dominated soul might not become a philosopher, so somebody who occupies himself with the study of the truth, but rather a sophist, which is somebody who is trained in rhetoric. And if we would use a very loaded term, or if we would use a very loaded word to describe him, that would be a demagogue. During this discussion on education, Socrates hints at the fact that a philosopher might possess a very special kind of knowledge. And this is a knowledge that is not attainable just through an education in gymnastics and music. It's a higher knowledge. Glaucon, of course, is eager to hear the end of it. Yet Socrates responds reluctantly to Glaucon. Even though Glaucon was able to understand the notion of justice, Socrates seems to be not sure whether Glaucon is able to apprehend this higher form or this special form of knowledge, which we'll come to understand as the idea of the good. Remember here, of course, that Glaucon's spirit is not dominated by reason, remember here that Glaucon's soul is not dominated by reason, but by spirit. So, rather than giving him a flat-out definition or direct answer to his question, Socrates poses to Glaucon a metaphor, in which he uses this metaphor or employs it as being the offspring of the good. And yes, we know that Socrates is prone to answer in metaphors, and this will not be the last metaphor that we will discuss today. So he gives Glaucon the metaphor of the sun. Let's have a look at this metaphor. I selected some passages from section 507b up until 508c. Let's hear it. In the course of the discussion, we have distinctly maintained that the existence of a multiplicity of things that are beautiful and good and so on, and also the existence of beauty itself and the good itself, and everything else which we previously regarded as many. We will now refer to them as a single idea of each as if it were a single being, and address each as that which is. And we assert that the former addresses themselves to the I and not to the mind, whereas the ideas address themselves to the mind and not to the I. Here we skip a bit ahead. Right, while granting that sight is seated in the eye and that it is the owner of its attempts to use it, and that color is present in what is to be seen, still, unless there is a third kind of thing devoted to this special purpose, you are aware that eyesight will see nothing and that colors will be invisible. Of course, I refer to what you call light. Neither the sight itself nor the eye can be identified with the sun. Well then, I continued, understand that I meant the sun when I spoke of the offspring of the good, begotten by it in a certain proportion to itself. That is to say, bearing the same relationship to the visible world, in the visible world to sight, and to the visible, which the good bears in the intelligible world to the mind and the knowable. End of quote. So what's being said here? First note that the dichotomy between the intelligible and the visible, where the good serves the same function in the intelligible world as the sun does in the visible world. So where the sun is the cause of sight, the idea of the good allows us to think about other ideas. So to come to knowledge about these other ideas, it makes it intangible or intelligible, if you want. This metaphor then continues to develop and talks about sun being the source of growth in plants, and then the good being a source for growth or shaping of the soul in light of the good. So here we get the first hint of what the idea of the good or what the good is about. There is a second, more extensive and definitely more famous metaphor that also deals with this question. This will be presented in Book 7 and is widely known as the cave allegory. So the cave is important to understand Plato's concept of metaphysics as well, but for the purpose here, we'll try to sidestep that one as much as possible. But let's zoom in to some important elements in this second analogy about the good. There are multiple themes that we could discuss. I will zoom in on two specifically, but feel free to come up with your interpretations of the metaphor, themes that you brought attention to or what that drew your attention during our in-class discussion. The first theme that I like to talk about would be blindness, and the second theme that I would like to talk about is the distinction between shadows and objects. Now, let's continue with the first one, being blindness. So that blindness might become important is already foreshadowed by Socrates in section 484c, where he says, "Then, do you think that there is a particle of a difference between the condition of blind persons and the state of those who are absolutely deprived of the knowledge of things as they really are, and who possesses in their soul no distinct paradigm?" He phrases this as a question, but knowing how the dialogues continue, the answer is obviously no, there is no distinction. So this blindness, or this not knowing, relates of course to the person who is also held captive in the cave. Right? Upon ascending towards the real world, or upon his release, he is blinded first by the light of the fire, but then blinded by the light of the sun, and therefore cannot see reality sharp at first. His eyes have to adjust to the brightness. That means go through a process which is toilsome, right? Education. And after this process is completed, or the adjustment to the light is completed, he will be able to discern the images of reality itself. So he's able to see again. He lost his blindness. Yet there is a second moment of blindness. Remember, the person in our cave allegory, of course, through a motive of duty, descends back into the cave, trying to impart the wisdom that he's learned or enlighten his previous cave mates. But upon descendance, he again loses his vision, this time blinded by darkness. Meaning that this leads to mockery among his fellows, or previously fellow cave mates, because he lost his ability, he's crippled. So there's also an interesting theme of violence to be discussed here if you're interested. It's a relationship between knowledge and violence. But what we see here that is now, he loses again his knowledge of these shadows, because his eyes are not adjusted, or his eyes are not fixed upon them. Here you can already see the relationship between a soul that should be fixed on truth and what happens if it does not. So every shock, so going in from dark to light or from light to dark, itself is a blinding exercise. Yet where the first one leads to knowledge, the second one does not, or leads to the good eventually, the second one does not. And Socrates maintains the position that through this education or clear reflection and deliberation of the mind, it's possible to discern between two times, or being blinded two times, which one actually leads to knowledge and which one does not. I very much hope, before we get into the discussion of the second theme, that the bells ringing on the background are not too disturbing. So, the second theme that I would like to talk about is this distinction between shadows and objects. So, the shadow figures represent the physical realm. Remember the realm of sight in the previous analogy, where the objects themselves represent our intelligible realm. So what we know, where real knowledge resides, if we make it a brief simplification. Note that before the person is freed, he can see the shadows rather clearly. And again, we have this adjustment period to the light. He cannot see these objects yet, but over time he will come to understand that the shadows which he holds to be true are actually just reflections, obfuscations, or colorless imitations of these real objects. Now, once his eyes are adjusting, he starts to see more and more and more of these objects clearly. He gains knowledge. But what is the last object that he's able to see? Well, the story ends with the person that's being freed looking, observing all these things, and then at first or at last only being able to see the sun in its reflection. And only at the very last he's able to look at the sun directly. Now we've said that these objects belong to the realm of ideas, to which you could have harmony, beauty, justice. And basically you get the idea here that there is a reflection which he looks at. Right? So there's a reflection of goodness in all these ideas. So goodness enables the understanding of all these ideas. And through occupying yourself, or the person occupying himself, with reflecting on, thinking about, investigating these other ideas, he can see bits and pieces of the good. And then finally, in the end, if his study is vigorously enough, he will be able to look at the sun itself. So the adjustment process has been completed. And then he will have an understanding of the ideal of the good. There is a second, more political interpretation possible of this shadows objects distinction. So it's possible to interpret these shadow games that they're looking at basically as our political games. And here we have a similarity with the ship analogy, right? So it tends to be that politics then focuses on the shadows, the things that do not really matter. Why? Because the people participating in politics, right, people actively engaging in it, this would be the sophists that we talked about earlier rather than the philosophers, don't see the real connection, or in our times we would say are more occupied with their own interest than a common good or stuff like that, and then throughout playing these shadow games, fancy rhetoric, are able to enflare some passions in the masses that will follow them, and then also come to the idea that what most media attention, for instance, is given to are the real important topics. And we see that this is kind of accurate for our societies. And so, let's say, more discussions that open up for great debates, which have a lot of rhetoric, are often ones that the public eye devotes more attention to than the more dry, technocratic, or more informed discussions, even though that topic might be of more concern to the citizen himself. Right? So we again see this link to the wise man on the ship, and maybe think about why he gets called a babbler by the crew. So, what have we now learned of the good? Well, we've seen that it's a standard for all other ideas, and that it cannot be known through teaching, but that it has to be discovered. So we now understand why Socrates was so hesitant to answer Glaucon's question, what is the good, directly, and instead gave him a series of metaphors. But do we also understand why the good ruler has to be a philosopher? given of how the good gives rise to all these other ideas. Might be interesting to ponder on that and then to take this discussion up in class. Do we also realize that ruling, as we also said before, like hinted at when we were talking about philosophers as politicians or philosophers as kings, is not a pleasant exercise for the philosopher? Right? We also see this in the cave analogy where the person goes down for a sense of duty. He wants to share this to his previous fellow cave mates. But it is not at all a pleasant experience from him. So ruling here comes out of a motive of duty to some extent. And somebody who, or the philosopher, is somebody who does not want to rule as such. This, of course, avoids the problem of tyranny, because the tyrannical leader is often characterized by ambition or his will to rule. So this is also why in the end Plato says that the philosophers, or the class of philosophers, which is not plentiful, but there might be more than one individual, will rule as kings and take turn in that, since only one of them has to occupy themselves with the political aspects rather than contemplating truths or the eternal ones, and then they will switch over. So now we know what the good city looks like and why we have this philosopher and its rule. We can again ask ourselves whether the system is stable, just like we did with justice in the roles reading. Right? We ask ourselves, is this indeed individually rational? Do people stick to these rules of justice that we have this current? This would be one way to read Book 8, which deals slightly with the question of if the philosophers don't like it, what would happen, and if something goes wrong. For instance, people start having sex and getting children at time slots which are not allocated by the state, maybe which is called non-seasoned sexual intercourse or births. This might lead to a descent in virtue or goodness of the state, and then it will go down and down and down and down. This is one way to read Book 8. The other way to read Book 8 is as an answer to a conversation which they had in the beginning of the Republic, which is basically where they are criticizing the constitutions of other states that are known at the time. And here it's interesting to think back to the quote that we did from the 7th letter last week, where Plato's intention behind writing the Republic was indeed his dissatisfaction with the unjust rule of the many city-states around him. If I recollect correctly, he states something that most constitutions or most states are unjust almost beyond cure. And then you see how each kind of next constitution that Socrates discusses with Glaucon is basically one step down on the ladder of virtue. These critiques of the constitutions and their respective vices and virtues, because most of them will be a mix, they have some good elements but are not completely perfect, are interesting to keep in mind when on Thursday or Friday, depending on which group you are in, we are discussing Aristotle, because he will mostly focus on constitutions and has therefore occasionally been named as the first real political scientist, because he liked to gather constitutions and compare them. Another thing which might be interesting to note in relation to Book 8 is the almost Oedipal line of reasoning which is presented, right? It's always son-father clashes in order to appease the mother. I think there's some nice insights there when we go to Freudian psychology later on. I just point this out, or we don't go to it, but I just point this out because in some of our classes we have discussed Plato and his idea of psychology, or whether he has an ethics or a theory of ethical psychology. If you would be interested in that, it might be nice for you to have a look at that motive while reading chapter 8. Where did democracy end up? As you'll go through Book 8, you'll see that it ends up somewhere near the bottom of the ladder. Here, think back, what are the virtues of our democracy, but also what are the vices of our democracies? Do you see how this relates to the ship analogy that we have done before? And would you be interested, maybe, after all these reflections, now as at least philosophers, maybe philosopher kings and queens in becoming, to change our societal structure, to change our constitution to something that would be less like a democracy and more like a philosophical kingship, Or do you think that Plato overlooks something and overemphasizes unity, for instance? Well, I'm looking forward to discussing these topics with you in class. I hope you have fun reading the text. And since we're using YouTube as a medium for publishing these lectures, I've gotten the feedback that at the end I should say, if you like these lectures, please give a thumbs up. If you are interested in more content on the history of Western political thought, then do not forget to click the subscribe button, as I will be uploading new content twice a week until the end of the period. Well, as always, I hope you enjoyed the video and see you later for the in-class discussion. Bye bye.